I never thought I would find myself in a situation where the very land I poured my soul into would become the center of so much unnecessary drama. But life has a way of throwing irony at a man who least expects it. My name is Jonathan Hale, and my vineyard is more than just a piece of land with neat rows of grapevines. It is the story of my life, the culmination of sweat, blood, and years of perseverance in the face of hardship. I had returned to the valley after spending most of my early life far from it, wandering through city skylines and chasing money that never seemed to buy me peace. The valley was a place I remember from childhood. The gentle slopes and golden light spilling across the hills at dusk, the soil rich with history, and the air always carrying the hint of ripened fruit in late summer. When I inherited a small portion of it from my grandfather, I never dreamed I would one day expand it into the vast stretch of vineyard that now wrapped around the hillsides for miles, a place not just of grapes and wine, but of legacy. It was here in this valley that I found both purpose and solitude. My mornings began with the hum of tractors in the distance, the laughter of workers who had been with me for years, and the quiet companionship of vines that seemed to breathe with me, rooted as deeply in the land as I was. Each vine had a story. Each cluster of grapes carried a future bottle of wine, and every bottle carried a memory of struggle and triumph. When I first came back to the valley, there was no talk of homeowners associations, no tightly wound committees dictating what shade of paint was acceptable for a house, no meddling neighbors clutching at bylaws like they were holy scripture. It was just land wide and free, and those who live here respected the soil and the space. But as the years passed, the world crept in, and with it came developers, investors, and suburbanites who wanted to trade the pulse of city life for the illusion of countryside charm. They carved neighborhoods into corners of the valley, spreading cul-de-sacs like weeds, lining them with copycat houses that stood like soldiers in a row. And with those neighborhoods came the inevitable. HOAs, little councils of self-appointed rulers who believed power could be found in clipboards and fines, who believed the valley was theirs to shape and dictate. They saw my vineyard not as the lifeblood of this land, but as an eyesore, something unruly and ungoverned, too free for their taste. I never paid them much attention. I owned my land outright, hundreds of acres of it, stretching further than they could even walk in a day, and no piece of paper signed in the subdivision's boardroom could touch it. But to people like them, ownership was less about deeds and more about illusion, and illusions are fragile things. It started small, the way these things always do. I heard whispers that my fences were too rustic, that my tractor noise at dawn was a disturbance, that the smell of fermenting grapes in the harvest season was offensive. I laughed it off because I thought surely no one would be foolish enough to believe they could dictate the operations of a vineyard that stood here for generations before their little HOA even existed. But ignorance has a way of breeding confidence, and soon enough I found little letters in my mailbox, signed with the neat signature of some HOA president who thought her authority extended beyond her manicured lawns. They spoke of violations, of bylaws, of citations that meant nothing in the eyes of the law, but everything to people who believed they ruled their small empires. I ignored them at first. Then came the complaints filed with the county, all dismissed because the county knew full well my land was agricultural and outside their jurisdiction. That only seemed to embolden the HOA more, as though my resistance was a challenge to their imagined throne. On the day it all came to a head, I was walking to the vineyard with clipboard in hand, noting irrigation adjustments and canopy management, when I saw flashing lights weaving their way down the gravel road that led to my estate. At first, I thought maybe something had happened in one of the neighborhoods nearby, perhaps an accident or a lost driver. But as the cruisers pulled up to my front gate, their lights bouncing across the rows of vines, I knew this was different. 2 squad cars, for officers stepping out, one of them already adjusting his belt as if preparing for a confrontation. Behind them, in her SUV, sat the HOA president herself, a woman named Margaret who had made it her mission to prove that my vineyard somehow violated her community's sanctity. She stepped out with the kind of smugness that only comes when someone believes victory is already theirs. Her clipboard clutched to her chest like a knight's shield. I leaned on the fence post and waited as the officers approached, their boots crunching against the gravel. The lead officer, a tall man with a square jaw and the air of someone tired of being used as muscle in neighborhood spats, introduced himself politely enough and explained that they had received a call about unauthorized agricultural activity within a residential zone. The words almost made me laugh, because if anything, it was a residential zone that had sprung unauthorized around me. Margaret wasted no time cutting in, declaring that my vineyard was in violation of HOA codes, that my equipment was hazardous, that my workers were a nuisance, and that the smell of wine production was unacceptable. The officers glanced at each other, clearly realizing they had been dragged into something absurd, but protocol required they investigate. So I led them through the gate, down the gravel path that stretched like a ribbon through the heart of my vineyard. As we walked, I could feel Margaret trailing close behind, her words sharp and constant. A barrage of accusations meant to paint me as some rogue farmer squatting on land that didn't belong to him. The officers listened in silence, but I saw their eyes taking rows of vines stretching beyond the horizon. The scale of it all, the sheer magnitude of ownership that no HOA could touch. When we reached the main house, a sprawling stone structure built by my grandfather's hands and restored by mine, I invited the officers inside. I laid out on the long oak table the deeds, the titles, the record of ownership that showed, in no uncertain terms, that not only did I own this vineyard, but I owned nearly the entire valley in which Margaret's subdivision had been planted. It took no more than 6 minutes for realization to dawn on their faces. 6 minutes for them to see that they had not been called to mediate a petty neighborhood dispute, but had been manipulated into trespassing on land that had been mine for generations. Margaret's smugness faltered as the officers asked her to step outside, their patience wearing thin with her entitled prattle. She stammered about bylaws and rules, but bylaws end at property lines, and mine stretched farther than her imagination could grasp. I stood there, calm and steady, the weight of the valley at my back, and I realized then that this was more than just a clash between me and an HOA. It was a battle between illusion and reality, between paper authority and a kind of ownership rooted deep in the soil, the kind that no vote in a community meeting could undo. For me, it was vindication. For Margaret, it was humiliation. For the officers, the silence after the officers stepped outside with Margaret was heavy, but it wasn't a silence of tension. It was a silence of victory, one that only comes when the truth sits so firmly in your corner that no argument can shake it. I poured myself a glass of my own wine, a deep red blend from last year's harvest, and sat at the oak table, letting the taste settle on my tongue like the valley itself speaking through me. I thought about the years it had taken to get here, the battles I fought long before Margaret and her clipboard brigade had ever shown their faces. My life hadn't been handed to me in a neat bottle with a golden label. It had been carved out of stone, built through storms, frost, drought, and more sleepless nights than I could count. When I looked out the wide windows of the house and saw the officers standing near their cars, their radio silent, their faces weary, I knew they were beginning to understand the weight of what they had walked into. They weren't just dealing with some homeowner dispute about lawn ornaments or paint colors. They were standing in the middle of a legacy that reached back through decades of toil. Margaret's voice carried faintly from outside, sharp and desperate, as though she thought volume might replace logic. I knew her type too well. People who had never built anything real, who sought power through petty enforcement because they lacked the courage to create something worth protecting. I had watched her subdivision go up years earlier, each house a copy of the last, plopped down on the edge of my valley, like invaders planting flags on soil they never truly understood. They came with their SUVs and their perfect lawns, complaining about the sounds of tractors at dawn or the hum of irrigation pumps in summer nights, never realizing that those very sounds were the heartbeat of the valley long before they set foot there. To them, the valley was just a backdrop, a pretty picture they could frame from their porches, a view to boast about during wine tastings hosted in kitchens that smelled of store-bought candles. But to me, the valley was flesh and blood, and their arrival was nothing more than noise trying to drown out a song that had been playing for generations. The officers eventually came back inside, one of them shaking his head with a kind of resigned frustration. They told me that Margaret filed multiple complaints, not only with them but with the county sheriff's office, and even the state agricultural board, all of which had already been dismissed for lack of jurisdiction. They had been forced to respond this time because she had claimed there were safety concerns, alleging that my vineyard equipment was being operated too close to her neighborhood, as though a tractor moving in a field was somehow a greater threat than the cars that sped down their own suburban streets. The officer looked at me with a faint smile, almost apologetic, and said they would be closing the matter immediately. I thanked him politely, though I didn't need his assurances. I had known from the moment they stepped onto my land that Margaret's crusade was doomed. What she didn't understand was that ownership here wasn't a matter of paperwork tucked into filing cabinets. It was etched into the soil, written in deeds that stretched across boundaries her little bylaws could never touch. But Margaret wasn't one to give up easily, and I saw in her eyes when she tried to push past the officers, her face red with indignation, her voice rising in shrill protest. She wanted to fight, wanted me to snap, want to play the role of victim against the big bad vineyard owner. Instead, I simply stood at my doorway, wine glass in hand, and told her in the calmest tone I could muster that this valley belonged to my family long before a neighborhood ever existed, and it would continue to belong to us long after her HOA crumbled. My words weren't for her. They were for the officers, for the land, for myself. She sputtered, tried to wave her clipboard like a weapon, but the officers escorted her back to her SUV and told her plainly that she had no authority here. I watched her drive off, tires kicking up gravel, and for the first time in years, I felt the kind of satisfaction that only comes when someone who thrives on control is reminded of how powerless they really are. Yet even as the taillights of her SUV disappeared, I knew this wasn't over. People like Margaret don't retreat gracefully. They stew, they plot, they come back louder and more desperate. I had seen it before, not just with her, but with others who had tried to dictate what this valley should be. Developers who want to pave over the vines and put up shopping centers. County officials who tried to rezone parts of my land for public good. Even distant cousins who had once argued for selling off parcels piece by piece. They all shared one thing in common. They underestimated me, underestimated the depth of my roots here. I wasn't just a man living in this valley. I was part of it. My blood was in its soil, my sweat in its vines, my breath in its air. You can't uproot something like that with a few meetings and a stack of papers. That night, after the officers left, I walked the vineyard under the stars. The sky was clear, the rows of vines stretching out like dark ribbons across the land, and the air was filled with that familiar earthy sweetness that reminded me why I had chosen this life. I thought about Margaret, about her crusade, and I couldn't help but feel a strange kind of pity for her. To live in a world so small that victory was measured in the color of someone else's shutters or the placement of a mailbox was a kind of prison I could never endure. I had built something real, something that breathed and grew, something that would outlast me. She had built a committee, and when she looked out her window each morning, she would see not victory but defeat. Rows upon rows of vines stretching farther than her rules could reach, a reminder every day that some things were beyond her grasp. Still, I wasn't naive. I knew she would return, and when she did, she would come armed with more than complaints. People like her always escalate when they fail. Maybe she'd call in inspectors. Maybe she'd file lawsuits. Maybe she'd rally her neighbors into thinking they were fighting some noble battle. But whatever she tried, she would find herself standing against something far bigger than a single man. She would be standing against a valley, against a history that refused to bend, against an ownership that no amount of paper could erase. And I would be ready for her, not because I enjoyed the fight, but because this land was mine to protect. It always had been, and it always would be. In the weeks that followed, the quiet of the vineyard returned, but it was not the kind of peace that comes when a storm has passed for good. It was the tense stillness that settles before another round of thunder. The harvest was approaching, and my workers were busy preparing. The air already heavy with the smell of ripening fruit. The vines were thick with promise, their clusters heavy, their leaves whispering with each breeze that rolled down the slopes of the valley. For most people, it was a season of joy, the culmination of months of labor, but I felt an unease lingering at the edges of my thoughts. Margaret had been silent, and silence from her kind was never a surrender. It was strategy. I knew she was waiting, plotting in the background, her pride too wounded to let things go. I could almost see her at her kitchen table, poring over bylaws and county codes, her mind twisting in circles as she searched for some loophole, some way to extend her reach in a land she had no claim over. And while I tended to my vines and prepared for the harvest, I carried the certainty that her next move was already in motion. Sure enough, it came one morning as I was inspecting the fermentation tanks in the winery. A convoy of white vehicles rolled up the gravel road. Inspectors, code enforcers, and one man in a suit who carried himself like an attorney. They stepped out, clipboards in hand, eyes sharp, clearly prepared for confrontation. Margaret trailed behind them in her SUV, her expression triumphant, as though she had finally assembled an army strong enough to topple me. I wiped my hands on my work shirt and walked out to meet them, calm as ever, though inside I felt the first flicker of anger. It wasn't anger at the inconvenience of it all, but at the sheer audacity of someone believing they could bend an entire valley to their will through bureaucracy and harassment. The lead inspector cleared his throat and informed me they were here to conduct a comprehensive inspection of my vineyard operations, citing complaints of improper waste disposal, unpermitted construction, and unsafe working conditions. The words spilled out like a rehearsed script. each one carefully chosen to sound official, but I could hear Margaret's fingerprints all over them. I didn't flinch, didn't argue, didn't even raise my voice. Instead, I opened the gates wide and invited them in. If there was one thing I had learned over the years, it was that truth shines brightest under scrutiny, and my vineyard was as clean and compliant as any operation in the state. The inspectors fanned out, taking notes, snapping pictures, peering into corners as though expecting to find some hidden violation that would justify their presence. Margaret followed at a distance, her face eager, her eyes sharp, like a vulture circling in hope of a carcass. For hours they moved through property, through the barrel rooms where oak casks lined the walls in neat rows, through the fields where workers moved with practiced precision, through the storage facilities where every piece of equipment was maintained to the highest standard. I answered their questions patiently, produced permits when they asked, and offered records that stretched back years. Slowly, I watched the certainty in their faces waver. They had come expecting a battlefield of violations. Instead, they found order, discipline, and a man who knew every inch of his land better than they knew their own laws. Margaret's smile faded as each inspector nodded, each box checked, each supposed infraction dismissed. By the time they regrouped at the front gates, their clipboards were filled not with evidence of wrongdoing, but with acknowledgement of compliance. The attorney stepped forward then, his expression tight, his words careful. He suggested that while I was indeed compliant, the character of the neighborhood had been negatively impacted by the scale of my operations. It was a clever attempt to shift the ground from law to perception, from fact to feeling. I looked him straight in the eye and told him that character cannot be dictated by committees, that the valley's character was written long before his neighborhoods existed, and that his client's discomfort was not grounds for erasing a legacy. He faltered, searching for a rebuttal, but the inspectors were already packing up, muttering that they had more pressing matters elsewhere. Margaret stood frozen, her clipboard clutched so tightly her knuckles turned white, her victory dissolving in the heat of reality. When the convoy left, she lingered in her SUV, staring at me through the windshield as though sheer willpower could change the outcome. I raised my glass of water to her in a silent toast, not a mockery, but of inevitability. She drove off without a word, her tires spitting gravel, and I knew she would not rest. Her pride had taken another blow, and pride is a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. It can drive people to madness, to obsession, to crusades that consume not only themselves but those around them. I pitied her again, though less gently this time, because pity is wasted on someone who sees kindness as weakness. That night, as I sat on the porch of the main house, the valley stretched wide and quiet before me. I thought about the strange war I found myself in. It wasn't fought with weapons or armies, but with papers, complaints, and desperate attempts to control what could not be controlled. Yet in some ways, it was fiercer than any physical battle, because it targeted not just land but spirit, not just ownership but dignity. And though I had won this round, I knew the war was far from over. Margaret would be back, with new tactics, new allies, new ways to twist the system to her will. And when she came, I would meet her again, not with anger but with the same unshakable truth that had carried me this far. For the valley was mine, not because of paper or permits, but because it was part of me, and no amount of noise could drown out that bond. The following months unfolded like a long chess match, every move calculated, every counter move inevitable. Harvest season came and went, and with it the valley came alive in ways that Margaret and her committee could never understand. The air was thick with the scent of crushed grapes, the winery buzzing with energy, barrels filling with the promise of vintages that would one day sit proudly on tables across the country. My workers sang while they worked, the laughter of families echoing across the fields as we pressed juice late into the night. To me, it was life at its fullest, a celebration of the land, of labor, of tradition. But to Margaret, it was yet another offense, another reminder that her bylaws meant nothing here. She didn't send inspectors this time, nor did she come storming up the road with her clipboard. No, she had shifted tactics, retreating into whispers and shadows, rallying her neighbors with stories of imagined dangers, spreading lies like weeds in fertile soil. I heard the rumors before long, that my vineyard was polluting the water supply, that my workers were undocumented, that I was hoarding land out of greed, even that my barrels leaked toxins into the soil. Absurd claims, all of them, but lies are like smoke. They spread quickly, clinging to everything in their path, staining the air even when there is no fire. I ignored them at first, focusing on my work, trusting that truth would outlast gossip. But when I received word that Margaret had petitioned the county to consider rezoning parts of the valley under public interest, I knew her campaign had grown teeth. It wasn't just talk anymore. It was a coordinated effort to chip away at my foundation. She had learned she couldn't touch me directly, so she was reaching for higher powers, trying to bend the county itself to her will. I called a meeting with my closest workers and advisors in the old barn that served as both storage and gathering hall. The air inside was cool, the wooden beams weathered but strong, like the valley itself. Around the table sat men and women who had stood with me for years, some whose fathers and mothers had worked these vines before them. They listened quietly as I explained Margaret's latest move, their faces hardening with the same quiet anger I carried. To them, this wasn't just about me. It was about their livelihoods, their families, their futures. If the county bent to Margaret's pressure, it wouldn't just be my vineyard at risk, but every job, every meal, every roof tied to this land. And so we planned, not with bitterness or fear, but with determination. We gathered documents, prepared statements, and reached out to allies in the agricultural board, the local business community, even the historical society that recognized the valley as a heritage site. If Margaret wanted to wage a war of paper and politics, then I would meet her on that battlefield, armed with truth and legacy. The day of the county hearing arrived under gray skies, rain threatening but holding back, as though even the heavens were waiting to see how the day would unfold. I walked into the chamber wearing my best suit, not to impress but to remind them that the vineyard was not just dirt and vines, but a legacy worth honoring. Margaret was already there, her army of neighbors filling the seats behind her, each of them clutching pamphlets and signs like soldiers preparing for battle. She looked at me with that same smugness I had seen before, certain that this time she had the upper hand. But as the proceedings began, it became clear how unprepared she truly was. She spoke of noise, of smells, of aesthetics, of property values, her words dripping with entitlement but empty of substance. She painted herself as a protector of her neighborhood, a guardian of peace, but the hollowness of her arguments echoed in the chamber like brittle wood snapping under pressure. When my turn came, I stood not just for myself, but for the valley. I spoke of history, of how my grandfather had planted the first vines when the land was nothing but wilderness, of how generations had nurtured it into something that fed not just stomachs, but spirits. I presented records showing compliance with every regulation, letters of support from businesses and families who depended on the vineyard, and even testimonies from environmental groups praising our sustainable practices. I reminded the county that the vineyard wasn't just private property. It was a cornerstone of the local economy, a heritage site that attracted visitors from across the state, a living monument to resilience. By the time I finished, the room was silent, not because my words were dramatic, but because they were undeniable. The board deliberated for hours, the tension thick enough to choke on, while Margaret paced the hallway outside, her face growing more drawn with every passing minute. When the decision finally came, it was unanimous. The petition was denied. Not only denied, but dismissed with language so strong it might as well have been a warning for her not to try again. My vineyard was protected, my ownership reaffirmed, my valley secured. Margaret stormed out before the gavel even fell, her neighbors trailing behind her like a defeated army, their signs drooping, their voices silenced. I stood there in the chamber, the weight of victory pressing down on me, not as relief but as confirmation. This was my land, my fight, and I had won. That night, back at the vineyard, I stood on the porch with a glass of wine in hand, watching the storm finally break across the valley. Rain fell in sheets, drumming against the vines, washing the dust from the leaves, filling the air with that sweet, earthy smell of renewal. I thought of Margaret, of her relentless crusade, and I realized that she was no longer just a nuisance. She had become a symbol of everything that tried to strip away what was real in favor of what was convenient, everything that tried to control instead of create, everything that mistook paper authority for true power. And as the rain soaked into the soil, I knew the battle was far from over. She would return, and when she did, she would be more desperate, more reckless, more dangerous. But I was ready. The valley had survived storms far greater than Margaret, and so had I. Together we would endure. Winter settled into the valley like a heavy quilt, the vines bare and skeletal, the ground hard with frost, the air sharp and clean. Harvest had ended months ago, the barrels now tucked away in the cellar, quietly transforming juice into wine, while the world outside rested. To most, winter meant stillness. But for me, it was a season of reflection, of planning, of walking the quiet roads with only my thoughts for company. The storms of the past year had tested me, not the kind that tore branches from vines, but the kind that came in the form of papers, arguments, and the relentless will of a woman who thought her clipboard could bend an entire valley to her will. Margaret had retreated after her loss at the county hearing, but I knew better than to think she was gone. People like her didn't fade into silence. They bided their time, waiting for cracks to appear, waiting for fatigue to set in. And yet, as I stood on the porch of the old stone house, looking out across land that stretched farther than my eyes could see, I felt no fear. I had weathered her storms, and in doing so, I had reminded myself of something I had nearly forgotten: why this valley mattered. One evening, as snow began to dust the hillsides, I received a letter not from Margaret, but from one of her neighbors. It was handwritten, careful, almost apologetic. The man explained that he and his family had grown tired of the HOA's constant meddling, that they had watched Margaret wage her crusade against me and realized how absurd it was. He wrote that when his children looked out across the valley, they didn't see an enemy. They saw beauty, history, something bigger than themselves. He thanked me for standing firm, for protecting something worth more than property values or bylaws. It was a small letter, but it meant more to me than any official ruling, because it proved that even in the midst of all the noise, truth had a way of reaching people. And over time, more letters came. Quiet notes slipped into my mailbox. Neighbors who admitted they had never agreed with Margaret but had been too afraid to speak up. Families who asked if they could tour the vineyard, if their children could walk the rows, if they could be part of something real. Slowly, I realized Margaret's war had backfired. In trying to turn the valley against me, she had only reminded people of what they stood to lose. By spring, the thaw returned, the vines pruned back and ready for a new season. The workers came alive again with the rhythm of the land. Tractors humming at dawn, irrigation lines hissing with water, laughter carrying on the breeze. And for the first time in years, I saw some of Margaret's neighbors wandering the edges of the vineyard, hesitant at first, but soon stepping in to join us. I welcomed them with open arms, offering them a taste of the wine, a walk through the fields, a glimpse of the life their bylaws could never provide. Their children ran between the rows. Their parents stood in awe of the barrels in the cellar, and I could see in their eyes the same spark that had drawn me back here all those years ago. The valley wasn't just mine, it was ours, all of us who respected it, who nurtured it, who saw it not as a backdrop, but as a living, breathing place. Margaret, of course, remained silent, her power slipping away one neighbor at a time. The HOA meetings grew smaller, the votes less unanimous. The authority she once wielded like a sword reduced to little more than whispers. I didn't need to confront her anymore. The valley itself had done the work. Every sunrise over the hills, every bottle uncorked at a family dinner, every child's laugh echoing across the fields was a reminder that her rules had no hold here. And though she still lived in that subdivision, still clutched her bylaws like a shield, she had been defeated not by me alone, but by the truth of the land she had tried to control. Now, as I sit here years later, writing these words with the sun setting over the valley, I realize that Margaret was never truly the enemy. She was a symptom of something larger, a world that has forgotten the difference between authority and ownership, between control and stewardship, between paper power and the kind of strength that comes from roots sunk deep into the earth. She thought she could erase a legacy with signatures and complaints, but legacies are not so fragile. They endure storms. They outlast the noise. They grow stronger with every challenge. My vineyard is still here. The valley's still mine, not because I fought harder than her, but because I belonged here in a way she never could. This land and I are bound together, and no law, no bylaw, no committee can sever that bond. When the last of the sun dips behind the hills and the valley is bathed in twilight, I raise a glass to the silence. A silence not of defeat, but of peace. The vines whisper in the breeze. The earth breathes beneath my feet, and I know, deep in my bones, that I have fulfilled the promise of my grandfather, of my father, of every generation that came before me. I have kept the valley alive, not just for myself, but for all who will come after. And when the world tries again, as it surely will, to claim what was never theirs, the valley will be ready, and so will I. For this is not just land, not just grapes, not just wine. This is legacy. This is home. This is the valley that I own, the valley that owns me in return. And nothing, not Margaret, not an HOA, not time itself, can ever take that away.